Presbyterians, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to welcome Brian Evans, who will be giving us a talk on Havering at Bower.
Brian? Somebody in your midst has already heard this talk, so I may have left. I'm still here. Still here. Of the Bower House and the Water Tower in Havering.
Yeah.
And it's just, I know that you've walked through Havering. I think Brian, your Brian, has done walks for charity through there, and you probably, no doubt many of you have gone through that village. But I just think how fantastic it is. As somebody who, I'm a sort of amateur champion. We did have Councillor Curtin, who was called the champion of local history for Havering and culture. I'm not sure about culture, but I've been championing the local history of this borough for about 45 years, believe it or not, starting at the library. So the amazing thing is we can see that Havering is quite an early Saxon settlement. So although people don't like the idea of us being in Europe, we've always been in Europe really, because the Saxons obviously came across from the continent. And Ing, Ham and Ton are all very early ones. So because it was in the time of Edward the Confessor or before that some sort of king's house or palace arose in that little village on the height of Havering village, on Havering Hill, which is about, what is it, about 300 to 400 feet high, quite high for Essex, and it's got that fantastic view across to Kent. So I always call that a royal view, and it's nice that we've got the hospice now, and perhaps some of the patients can see that royal view as well as the lovely garden they've now got in the... but in Ham and Tom, Dagenham, Havering, Wellington, Ing's in the middle there, Rainham and Barking, they're all early Saxon settlements. So those were the people that were here, and they were the early kings. So this borough really has got a great connection with national history. And here we are, even on the Bayeux Tapestry, you've got our friend Harold, after whom Harold Wood was named. He was a successor to Edward the Confessor. But what a great and interesting guy Edward the Confessor was, because when we say Havering Bower legendary village, or village of legend, it's because to start off with, there's two legends about him, isn't there? This is, by the way, is Harold. He got lured across. Edward sent him across to France, where Edward the Confessor himself had grown up. So although he was a Saxon king, he already had links to the Normans, and he'd been brought up in Normandy. And that was to avoid other people coming into the country, i.e. the Vikings. They sent him away because they knew he might succeed, and they didn't want him in the country at that time. But then when he came back and was king, Edward the Confessor, he was actually surrounded by quite a lot of people from the one family. Harold being one of them, and the most senior, and they all had bits of territory of England. Harold had the south of England. So we've still got a little bit of a reminder of that in Harold Wood. And because it's only recently they created Harold Hill, based on Harold Wood and Noak Hill. This is when Harold went across to Normandy. You know, it's fantastic that our people, as we can call them, our kings, were on the Bayeux Tapestry. He got captured. It was a bit dangerous. I don't know whether Edward did this deliberately, sent him across, but he got captured, and William the Conqueror got hold of him from one of the other groups that had captured him, and he got him to swear on these sacred, this shrine, that he would allow William to become King of England, not Harold himself. So there's quite a story there. And this is the story of Edward, the Confessor's legend. The legend, I sort of groan every time this comes up. Havering is supposed to be the origin of the name Havering, because it's a nonsense really. It's just a nice little way of remembering the name, and as we've seen, it's really a Saxon name. But while Edward the Confessor had his palace up at Havering, and I believe the church the chapel was being founded there, he came across this beggar, or this beggar came across him and asked for alms. And Edward gave him something to, some valuable, a valuable stone, precious stone, and sent him on his way. A long while later, this is a carving of the legend. I think there's carvings of this in several places. I can't remember if this is Westminster Abbey or not. Because you see, Edward actually founded Westminster Abbey, so another great link with national history. But in this case, these two travellers came back. You see, they've got the travellers' staffs at the front, and came back to Edward and said, they brought the ring back and said that the person he'd given it to was actually John the Baptist, John the Evangelist, and that's why the church at Havering is called St John's. And it was part of the palace originally. Now, the story is, of course, that over many centuries, various kings, right up to the time of Charles I, came to that palace. It must originally have been a wooden palace. And Edward the Confessor came away from London. You can imagine, even in those days, London was full of smells, full of disease. Too many people in one spot, even in those days. And it was good, and noise, and people pressuring him, because obviously there were all these other claimants to the throne from the one family, and he wanted to get away. And the story was put around that he was a holy person. Well, this legend, the first legend, didn't certainly help that idea, and it was obviously put around because there wasn't any media in those days. Obviously, in the 11th century, you didn't have anyone to spread the story. It had to go by words of mouth. So it had to be a good story, just like a parable in the Bible. And this is the story. And people thought so much it showed that it did spread because it's carved in stone in various places. The actual scene. The other legend, of course, is that he wanted to pray at Havering in the peace and quiet, and he bid the nightingales to go away. They were disturbing him. So that's the second legend, really. That kind of also circulated around the country, so that people knew what sort of king he was. He didn't have the BBC to tell him. He didn't have the Daily Mail to tell him. They might have got it wrong, mightn't they? So
need the sun.
sorry. The press are always, like they put Prince Charles on the spot at the moment, you can see they're always eager for a good royal story. And they wanted the people around the king wanted the good royal stories. And you've got to remember that often the people around the king in those days were the church officials. And it became interesting to them to see that Edward could be presented as quite a pious, religious person. Because we don't really know, do we? This was the story put around. But he was also a hunting person, and that's another reason he loved going to Havering, because obviously you have the Royal Hunting Forest. You could go for miles hunting from Havering. It was a good place also to receive ambassadors from other countries. Later on in history, Henry VIII's time and other times, you had it was a good place for them to come, and it put England in a good light. Our own Havering village put England in a good light. The nightingales seem to have come back at various times. This is Harold now. I just like this on the Bayeux tapestry again, because this could be a representation of Havering Palace, couldn't it? It would have been a wooden construction, because Essex obviously had trees and not much stone. It started off as a wooden construction. It was only later that the power of the king, the royal money and treasury was able to bring in lots and lots of stone. They'd have to bring it quite a long way and drag it up that hill. The odd thing is, for a long time I think people thought that everything started in the village, that history started in the village with Edward the Confessor or with the Saxon kings. But not the right way. Long before, people like this were probably walking around there, because they tend to be presented early in this way as really like savages. But in more recent times, some of the a little hole's been blown in this idea. First of all, you've got places like Stonehenge, which must have took a lot of ingenuity to build, and it must have entailed a lot of knowledge of mathematics. And a guy from Scotland called Professor Tom reckoned that they had a measurement, the megalithic foot or yard, which you can obviously translate into miles as well. And if you go across Europe, there are all these megaliths, aren't there? And they seem to all have been a connected civilization, an idea, a construction that went right across from Scotland, right across to France, and even down further. And in the 1970s, there was an amateur archaeologist came up to Havering, and he reckoned he found post holes. And okay, it wasn't like this, Stonehenge perhaps, the way they got the stones to Stonehenge. It was because they weren't going to use stone, they were going to use wood. They have found a wood henge near Stonehenge, haven't they, I believe, in recent times, and that's been... and we think that this archaeologist thought that really these post holes represented a wooden henge. And when he looked at all the angles and all the measurements, he reckoned that this was connected in to all the other places across Europe, across from Scotland through England, Avebury and all those monuments in England, right through to the French monuments. But it was a wood henge, an early example. It may have been a precursor, so they knew a lot. They knew, and when he worked out these measurements, he actually drew it all out as a surveyor, and it made sense. The angles all seemed right, and that they'd been calculated, and the measurements that they'd been calculated. It's a bit of a mystery. Nobody in London thinks that Havering's got a history, so they haven't really investigated this story, possibly. And unfortunately, our friend, the amateur archaeologist, is not around anymore to tell them about it. Well, other things that have been found are little blocks, masses of copper. Bronze. And some of those went to other museums. Before we had a Havering museum, which we've got now, these bits of, they were just a working metal that they used, but this is the sort of thing they turned it into, and you can see there's a lot of art and information in these, and skill. So somebody has written a book called Civilization 1, saying that what we think about very ancient peoples long before the Romans came, that there was lots and lots of people with a lot of scientific knowledge. And again, these are made into sort of accents. So I've got our old friend, the Centurion, because the main road from London to Colchester, as you know, ran through Romford, and I think the Roman town, it's actually got a name. Not many places in England have got a Roman place with a name, and it's Duroletum, and I think it's roughly where what they now call, they've got signs up saying Hare Street, haven't they? Where the Unicorn and the Ship and the other pub that used to be a proper pub but is now kind of, has become one again really, the Archers. Why are there 3 places of refreshment? So it's a short way beyond Romford. And they've obviously go back centuries when all the rest was fields. Until the 19th, early 20th century, there was Romford, a small little town, almost a village, and a whole swathe of fields all the way around. And yet, just beyond at Hare Street were these kind of 3 hostelries. And I think it's one of these examples of history coming down, the thread of history, that it once was Duroletum. It was a kind of Roman service station, like you might have on the M1, because it was the major road. After all, the London to Colchester Road, and very many important officials were whizzing along it. Apparently they had a separate track, I think, for officials and soldiers and people connected with him, with the rule over England. So other people had to get out of their way. Just like later on the mail coach, when it blasted its horn, the Royal Mail, still called, they had to get out of the way because the official posts and that had the priority. But why I mentioned, and this is the one of the Roman gates at Colchester, well if there was one at Duroletum it would only be, again, a wooden one probably. And it is interesting, there is an area of land on the side of, across Romford Golf Course at Gideon Park, that is, has been listed at various times as an ancient monument, because it looks like it's a very, very old road. Well, I think that's probably an alternative road. At different times they had to alter the course of the road. The present main road was a later version of that. It does dip and doesn't go so straight as it does from London, and later on through Colchester Road going past Gallows Corner. There's also another line of hard, what looked like metal road, went across the Gideon Park Sports Ground, that Gallows Corner. So there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest. But why we mention this in relation to Havering Village is that I haven't got the picture of that, but Havering Museum was known a gold ring which was found in the 19th century. No one knows exactly where, in Havering Village. And a very interesting thing about this ring is it had a representation of a classical idea that came before George and the Dragon. And it's a similar kind of idea. They're different names, and they reckon this ring could have been just in between the pagan and the Christian eras. So for a short time, the British Museum people came down and put it in a case at Havering Museum, and then they came and took it away again after about 6 months. So we did have it on loan, one of the bits of Havering history, which is in the British Museum. The thing is about, we've still got the kind of picture of it and the information about it in the museum in High Street, Romford. But there again, the palace having been there so long, it started to get onto seals that you stamped on important documents. And this is a representation of the gatehouse of Havering Palace. After it has probably got a stone version, and it just represents the whole palace. And that symbol has come down. It's even on the Havering coat of arms today. I do like these links. And when Morney Baths, Romford Baths in Morney Road existed, in the front they had the symbol again here, the gatehouse of Palace of Havering. Got a nice little portcullis there, and underneath the dreaded ring. That jewel that was given back to the confessor is supposed to be part of the crown jewels, the royal jewels. Part of the crown, one of the crowns that's in the crown jewel collection at the Tower of London. So a bit of our history is also in the Tower of London. Everywhere you go, you have that one. And that one. This is just showing how they might have started to construct. When in the Middle Ages, as kings got more and more organised and had treasuries and that, they were building places all over England. And because obviously the church had a lot of other money, they built the cathedrals. But could be something like what happened when Havering Palace was turned into a stone palace. And it's just from a medieval document, because you don't have much evidence of these kind of things. But it's interesting to see how they represented this. And over the years, different kings came and went, and all sorts of quite work was done, you know, nice work was done in windows even, in the days when most people had never heard of windows, proper windows, they were inserted, and often they had kind of the royal arms on them. And apparently, quite often, things that were put into Westminster Abbey, because of that connection with Edward, were duplicated at Havering Palace. But the trouble was, I think they did have a hard job to keep it going, because there were so many royal palaces around, weren't there? And you never hear Havering Palace mentioned, do you? When they talk about royal palaces, there's all these other ones, like Nonsuch and Richmond, and you don't hear about Havering, but it did last, and it was quite an important palace at different times, mostly in the summer, because obviously it was probably a very cold place. You'd have to put the tapestries all around the doors and the windows in the winter to keep it warm. This doesn't come out very well. It's just the only plan of Havering Palace. You can see a lot of little boxes along the bottom, and a sort of roughly square P shape. And there's all sorts of things there. 2 chapels, a royal chapel, and the chapel that eventually became the Church of Havering. Well, it had been St John's Church, but it was really part of the palace, and probably Hello.
What are you doing, drop it?
Okay. I've gone a bit higher. That's the trouble. We've got a bit higher. Come back again. Right, this is not a very good representation. 3 people from the Romford Historical Society, was that in the 70s? Yeah, I think, actually did research into where the palace lay. Obviously part of it lays under where the church is, and probably if you dug down under the tower, which is open, you can walk through the tower of St John the Evangelist at Havering, and probably underneath there is the old church, because it was rebuilt in 1875. But this is just one idea of what the palace might have looked like. Now then, do you know this is modern history and it's already gone, isn't it? I don't know if Brian knows where this went. Part of the Liberty, students from Havering Technical College did this kind of rather nice series of plaques, wall plaques. And obviously this relates to the medieval history of Havering. And you can see it's quite a good, they've obviously done their homework quite a bit. And you can see the soldiers perhaps guarding the palace. It includes sort of a palace and a church, I think the idea of this, and possibly even a reference to Westminster Abbey. But these plaques were taken down when they were renewed, weren't they? And there's only one by Mercury House, it's probably the least inspiring one. Now then, everybody knows this fella? Yeah. The Green Man. When you lived in a village like Havering in the medieval ages, and right up to perhaps the 19th and early 20th centuries, you tended to be very superstitious, particularly in earlier times when you didn't have good sources of lighting. So often, in a way, you could look at it as a pagan idea, that there was a sort of man, a green man, he was the spirit of the forest, which was all round the people in Havering, wasn't it? At night, when it became dusk, particularly in the winter, you'd get all these whisperings and sighings and noises, and people thought it must be a spirit or a person. So they represented it as a green man. And it became so well known, this idea, that it's put into churches sometimes, like this one here. It's not in a Havering church, but I thought it was an interesting thing. Well, anyone know what this is? The Armada. And we just mention it because Elizabeth was at Havering Palace a lot of times, and she was even at a subsidiary palace which was called Pergo, originally Port Gore, which was another house in the village. But quite a lot happened in Henry VIII's time. He often brought people up for hunting to the Havering Palace. This isn't Henry VIII, but we've got to move on quickly. And I just wanted to mention that the 3 royal children were at Havering in Tudor times, Henry VIII's children altogether. Although they might have been divided between, the girls might have been in Pergo, and the Edward VI, as he was to become, was probably in the palace itself. What I want to say about that is that when envoys came from abroad, they didn't look at Elizabeth or Mary because they thought Edward VI was a beautiful little child. They really thought he was the most glamorous child. It was probably because he was a bit sickly actually, and he just sort of had that kind of otherworldly kind of look that young children and frail people have. Anyway, so there's quite a story in Tudor times, but then James I came down from Scotland. I don't know if anybody's got Scottish roots here. What would he do when he came down to England? He's taking over a foreign land in a way, well, and becoming king. He'd want to know what the assets were, wouldn't he? Especially if he's from Aberdeen, I don't think he was. But he'd want to know the assets. He looks at Havering, all the details about Havering, and where's Knight Woodland gone? It's all been chopped down. Of course, the canny people of Havering had been given a charter in the Middle Ages that they could do their own law. That the High Steward of Havering was the second to the king in law, and they were running their own affairs quite successfully, although it was supposed to be a royal royal land and a royal territory, the kings didn't often interfere. Suddenly James I finds all his woodland's been chopped down. Obviously with growing population you need crops to be grown, so the canny people in Havering, I think they're still like that, aren't they, took their chance. And I don't know how this was sorted out at all, but he was probably a bit upset about this, but then he had to think about other things as well, so perhaps Havering got off. It didn't lose its charter even. Now, because this is Charles I being beheaded in Whitehall, in front of Whitehall Palace, still there, and he was the last king to come to Havering Palace, and this was a good story. His mother-in-law came across from France, Mary de Medici, and you probably know this story. Obviously his wife, Charles I's wife, was the daughter of Mary de Medici. She was hated in France and she was hated in England, but she insisted on coming across. I suppose she might have wanted to see her daughter. Anyway, Charles met her on the road, because in those days you normally landed at Harwich, so you came all the way down the old Roman road, and he put her up at Gidea Hall. That was a crafty one. Gidea Hall was an amazing place earlier on, the original Gidea Hall, not the later one that still existed till 1930. It looked like a palace. He's probably told her this is the palace you're going to be in, because she probably only wanted to stay at the best places, you know. But not having a book to tell her where the best places were, he probably told her this was the palace. Then he went up to Havering Palace to get away from her overnight. Although it was a bit drafty by that time and beginning to sort of go downhill, he'd rather stay at Havering Palace than stay overnight with, I think she was quite a talker. And she was probably complaining. She was probably complaining all the time. You know, you married my daughter. What good's it done her? So, poor old Charles, but that was probably, that didn't help him probably either. It probably led to part of the thing that led to his execution, the fact that he'd invited this most unpopular person across, apart from all these other reasons. So, we move on. Gone back. Cromwell. Well, by his time, of course, it was more or less in ruins, but they probably took a lot of the stone away. He wasn't too worried about royal palaces. Well, certainly not Havering Palace, which is right out on the edge. Like a lot of people in London today, he wasn't that interested in Havering. I tried to get Boris interested in Havering. He came down for a visit, you know. So and when he came in the museum, I thought at least he's come to the museum, I'll give him a book. So I gave him a book, and apparently the other day it was mentioned. I've got a book in my office about Havering when he came to support Conservative councillors, and I often look at it, so I'm quite pleased about that. But it means we're promoting Havering, you know, I'm not that keen on Boris. But anyway, Oliver Cromwell, I've been controversial, why not? Oliver Cromwell obviously was around, and the palace was beginning to be in ruins. So a lot of the stone was being stolen. I reckon that a lot of the houses underneath in the village today are probably built on foundations from stone from the palace, you know. I mean, they're the successors to about 2 or 3 other buildings that have been built on that site. But the stone from the palace provided a really good foundation. And we definitely know the stones from the palace did go to one building. Well, not the church, but this is just nice to see the church in the early 20th century. To see there wasn't a proper road across the common, but you had the stocks there, which are still there, the updated version. And oh gosh, we've got another little legend, haven't we? You've heard about her? The Goat Lady of Havering. She lived in this house. She was quite well off apparently. She used to go down to Romford sometimes for provisions, and I think she had some sort of bank account or something. But she lived in this palace with mostly goats, and they were beautiful, beautiful goats. But twice a year, she had to pay someone to clean out the house. Do you know that house is still there? It's a long time since that happened, all this happened. But she was quite a noble, gentle lady. And actually, she put Havering on the map. People came from all over. I think travellers from Europe came to look at her. Because what did you have in those days? You didn't have many, and to look at the goats and the animals and to sort of not believe, my goodness, this woman is living in this situation. There's even some cats. And there were all sorts of other different animals at different times. Now then, of course, the thing is, there wasn't much to see. I mean, they used to go to Bedlam, didn't they, the madhouse, to watch people. So this was a fashionable thing. I mean, well-to-do people who travelled, they wanted to do something on a Sunday, they go, and this is one of the sites. They heard about it, and it was written up in history. Going back a little. It's difficult to get this one going forward sometimes.
No, really? Very difficult.
Hooray! So what I wanted to say is, this line of descent of ideas, you know what this is? They represent the Nightingales. Where are they? On St Edward's School Kids Badge. So we've got that story going back to the professor, still represented in Havering today. And there's other things, but they're all out of order probably. Well, yes, this is interesting. I mean, this looks a bit strange to me. This is sort of medieval carpentry, building a house. They didn't always build it quite like that. It looks very modern actually, but it is from an old print. But why I want to mention this is you can probably see some of the ideas in the way the old wooden palace of Havering was represented today in Havering. Where? The Tithe Barn. 1450. Brilliant, brilliant. The best in England. Carpentry. Put together a barn. And it's very long barn and brilliant carpentry. You look up and it's like a cathedral in wood. And that was mainly because the church paid for it. They had the money. So another link with the past. Well, the Bower House, we've got to the Bower House. This is where some of the bricks from, and some of the masonry from the old palace went. And of course there's even a coat of arms in there. I'm not sure if it's hidden or whether you can see it at the moment. There are lots of spooky stories though. This is only about 1729, a London lawyer. He was a sergeant at law, the sort of thing that Dickens used to like, all these categories of lawyer that don't exist anymore. He wanted to retire, and he didn't live long, so it was his daughter Lucy Baines. I think there was a sad story about her, and she's supposed to haunt the house, and there are some, in the 50s and 60s, there were quite a lot of spooky things happen when people were there at night. Well, that tends to happen when you're on your own, doesn't it? The house moves. Oh my God. I mean, there were palaces in Havering, and there were palaces. People came out and built houses like this. Had a bit of money. It's incredible. I mean, it's like a palace, but it isn't, of course. It was this. I think this is. I get this confused. I've got two slides of the thing, and I'm not sure. I think this is Pergo, but there was also Havering Park, and they were both built in a rather grand style. This was the successor, you see, Pergo, that succeeded the subsidiary Royal Palace that happened in Henry VIII took away from one of his officials, Sir Brian Chew, because he was in the habit of doing. Lifting houses from people, like Hampton Court was lifted from, was it Wolsey? And now we have St Francis Hospice, which we all love and support, and it's wonderful what's been done to it. But that's on the site of many older houses, so probably under the foundations there is a bit of a palace. And this is the one that's upside down, right? It's the orange tree, and it was called, I believe it was called the olive tree, but what's nice about it, well this is even nicer, isn't it? Let me get it back. Yeah, look at that rural landscape, and that's only about 1900, isn't it? But still there, of course, but at this time, and earlier, it would have been a wonderful place for Dick Turpin. I know everybody says this, but he had to come down from the Epping Forest area when he went down as far as Dagenham and places like that and committed all sorts of terrible crimes. But this was one of the places, it was away from Romford, where all the professional people, the lawyers and all that were. So in the 18th century, or whatever it was he was going, he might have stopped off there. Because there would only be gamekeepers mainly, and people worked on farms in there originally. Obviously it's been extended a bit since, and they wouldn't tell on anybody, would they? They wouldn't tell on an ordinary person. It's only these professional people who came to Romford, and perhaps Hornchurch as well, I don't know. Well, this is a story about, we're about to finish, aren't we? This is a story about Walter. This is the way they used to get hold of Walter. There's a water carrier, And the story behind this is that Havering didn't have its own mains until well into the 20th century. And in the early years of the 20th century, one of the inns that was next to the Royal Oak burnt down because they couldn't get the fire, they couldn't get the water to it good enough. The fire service came from Romford. The fire service from Romford were a bit like they're a bit jumbled now, so I haven't got the fire service from Romford, which is false driven. And I've got this one upside down as well. Does anyone know what that is? It's a document.
Yeah, it's upside down.
It's a document upside down, but it might have been shown that way because people couldn't read. And it's interesting. People were given this document because Havering was a liberty, and it had its high steward who had the authority from the king. I've got two slides behind each other now. We'll pass on. Yeah. Still upside down, never mind. This document gave people the right to go to any other market or anywhere where tolls were being collected in England. Not that there would be many travellers, but some people from this area might have gone. And he could say, this is the warrant that says I can not pay toll because I come from the liberty of Havering. But of course we do wonder about this. Can you imagine someone in the North Country saying, come off it in his own lingo, I'm not having this, this is a lot of nonsense. But on the document itself, it has, by the power of the king, and he's still described as holding places in France, and this is the 18th century. So they were using old legalese language, as they do. Yeah, sorry they fell up. Well, this was that wonderful tree by the stocks, and you can still see the stocks but not the tree. The villagers tried to save it, but obviously it got a bit, in various storms, being so high up, it got into a terrible state, and the bottom of the trunk started, they had to put concrete and all sorts in it, but in the end it had to go, so there was a tremendous fight over that. People in Havering do fight for things to try and that's why it's still, I suppose, quite a good it's quite a good sort of representation of the past, really. You still get that feeling of quiet, unlike when I'm speaking. Yeah. Well, that's another thing that's still in Havering, not this particular one, but this is the Prince Shane witch ducking, and the ducking pond is still there. It's half outside the wall of the hospice and half inside. You can still see it. You've got, because it's dried out, but this is where the ducking pool was, so that's still there. And again, the signs have changed, but the stocks are still there. And the green, which is protected under 1911 Commons Preservation and Open Space Preservation Act, something like that. And that's it. It's all summed up in the coat of arms today. At the top is the Havering Palace. And you've got your Hornchurch symbol as well, the bull's horns. And there's a sort of thing about Edward, really, that he was such a devout person. You've got the cross on the top of the palace gateway, and you've got the dreadful ring, which is in the crown jewels. And you've got liberty, and it's back to front. Did you notice? Right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was very interesting. Anybody got any questions?
What's that?
Ron?
I wonder if Forest Gate has any connection.
If Boris?
Forest Gate.
Oh yes.
I wonder if that has any connection with the Havering Forest.
Yeah. Well, it is, isn't it? Because you've actually got the kind of open ground there, which led up to the forest, and all the cattle were often behind Forest Gate. You've got what's it called? Near to the cemeteries. Yeah. You've got that open ground, and a lot of cattle that were brought along the Great Road to be sold in London sometimes, or brought to Romford Cattle Market. Stoke. So it got, when they started, everybody started reading writing, late 18th century, because they were saying it Romford, and of course people into the 20th century were saying it. It was usually more well-off people, It's a little bit of an affectation, I feel. You heard people saying ironed coupe. I say ironed coupe because I know I'm a Rumfordian.
Okay.
And other people would say Ind coupe. Oh, they were people who didn't know the brewery. And it was written down on lots of maps. It was even a post stamp in the early days of the post, you know. But it's early in the 19th century it died out.
Shopping hall.
Although they put it on the shopping hall, you see, it's a nice bit of history. Yeah.
Ryan, what was the Roman, and Hare Street, what was the Roman settlement called there, the Roman junction?
The
On
name?
Yeah, how do you write it?
D-U-R-O
D-U-R-O.
L-I-T-U-M. Durolitum. It might have meant hard shore. Because it was guarding the crossing of the Rom
Yeah.
in Romford itself, but probably in the middle of Romford at that time was a pool of water.
Right.
Because the Rom wasn't drained and none of, you know, so it's a natural hollow, isn't it, in Romford?
Any fellow, any other questions?
I hope they're all dazed, you know, after I finished.
That was totally fascinating.
Very
And it's
good.
obvious it's a great interest to you, and your
Yes.
enthusiasm obviously comes across
Yeah.
in what you've had to say.
It's all I've got, enthusiasm.
Your boundless enthusiasm.
Yes, thank you.
And maybe Ron could maybe have you come again at some time in the future, because you've only scratched the surface.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
right.
You haven't even scratched it.
Yeah.
Sometime in the future where you can
Okay.
expand on
I've just
other
got to
matters
run
of
this out.
this very interesting area.
Right.
Fellows, I'd like you to show appreciation. Right, now, the most important function you have to perform, Brian, the
Yes?
most important function
Oh,
you
yes,
have
I know.
to
Yeah,
perform,
I know. I've been
first
before.
of honesty, integrity, of many of those in this room.
I want to give everyone a good chance. When I make you a raffle, I like to stir it round, you know, really well, because often